accessibility isn't always going to be perfect, or inclusion isn't always going to be perfect, but let's just start with something and then build from there. Let's just get the person in the door and then we can kind of up the ante. I always split disability between two models. There's a medical model and a social model / UN model. And the medical model was really a significant part of community perception when I was growing up. And the medical model was, if you were a person with this disability, you had to be fixed, cured or healed of that disability. Your disability was the reason why you couldn't participate. Whereas the social model is about disability has intersectionality. You can be a man, you can be a woman, LGBT+, whatever the case is, disability intersects across all of those cohorts. And it can happen today, it can happen tomorrow, it can be permanent, it can be temporary. When you plan for it, you actually make your workplace better for everyone, ultimately.
Welcome to Stories Untold, live from Cairns Crocodiles. We're unpacking the stories we carry but don't always tell, the stories we've untold ourselves and the stories that are still being written. In this series, we're going to spotlight the overlooked, the unpolished and the unspoken experiences that have shaped some of Australia's most creative and influential minds. Let's dive in.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another very special episode of Stories Untold. I have the great privilege of being joined by Paul Nunnari. Paul is a Paralympian, a social advocate, and the CEO of Inclusively Made, a movement championing and setting the standards for accessibility in media and business. Paul has a background in public policy and lived experience at the coalface of DE&I, and is rewriting the rules around inclusion, challenging not just what we make, but who we make it for. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. It's awesome to be here.
So you have a very, very filled plate. I mean, not just this week, but in general. So when people ask you what you do, what do you tell them?
I love have been a Paralympian. I think that's quite a unique achievement and something I'm very proud of doing. So I don't always start with that, but it's nice just to have that as part of my experience to be able to share. But very proudly, our CEO of Inclusively Made. And as you mentioned, we're really working hard to work across brand, film and TV on authentic representation of people with disability.
What's a story about you that rarely gets airtime but says everything about who you are?
That's an awesome question, actually. I'll probably defer back to when I share my story very, very briefly and succinctly, and that is, as an 11-year-old, I sustained a road trauma, which meant I had to use a wheelchair for the rest of my life. That wasn't a negative experience for me. The first thing I wanted to do in hospital when I knew I was going to be in a wheelchair was chase nurses and learn to do wheelies. And I've been doing that ever since. And I love it. Wheelchair's always been an enabler, not a disabler. And there's nothing wrong with having disability. So it's just been a really great mechanism for me to kind of change perceptions and misconceptions around disability.
And beyond I think that formative event, is there an untold story, something that might be a little bit more of a microcosm but speaks to the person behind the CEO of Inclusively Made?
It's such a great question. I think probably one of the untold stories for me is just around not seeing authentic representation of myself when I grew up, when I was growing up. You know, back in the day, you watch content on film or TV or through marketing and branding, and I never really saw myself reflected in the images or the content that I was watching. And so that's a bit of an untold, because you don't really get an opportunity to share that with anyone, and if you do it, what can you do about it? And so that's really kind of informed my journey and who I am and what I want to do with that experience to make it better for children today.
Yeah, awesome. And if we look at your career, right, and you can think of that in its most abstract or in your professional career, is there a juncture or like a moment in time where there's a really clear before and after that has shaped a change in path or a divergence?
Yeah, there were two moments.
All right, let's start with the first.
So the first moment was when I was first injured. I was in hospital, and when you're in hospital, when you sustain a spinal cord injury, you've got to the treatment back then was you had to lay flat. And I was flat in bed on my back for about 6 weeks. Oh, wow. So by the time I was able to kind of sit up and get into a chair, it was an amazing blessing. But I remember the first thing I saw when I was in hospital was a poster promoting the 1984 Paralympic Games. I saw this wonderful athlete, and he looked like the Incredible Hulk. He wasn't green, obviously, but he was in a wheelchair. But I didn't see the wheelchair. I saw just how muscular he was. And I thought, if I see that through that image, through his athleticism, through his physique, through his competitive nature, that's what I want to be like. So that was very defining for me, because that was kind of a path that I was like, I love sport prior to injury, and I wanted to love sport post-injury. And then definitely competing at the Sydney Paralympic Games in 2000. It was a game changer, I think, for everyone. Really, I think, really changed perceptions for the next generation. All those kids who were at that event watching, they're now employers. And I think they have a better perspective on disability and inclusion than probably the previous generation.
And if we stay on that second moment, what about you changed, right, in that before and after moment, you know, pre-Olympics, post-Olympics?
So I went to Atlanta for the Paralympic Games there.
I said so.
And so I was a Paralympian before Sydney, but I won a medal in Sydney. And that changes a lot of things. It changes, it gets you to meet people that otherwise probably wouldn't meet you, and gives you that platform to advocate for things that you've been advocating for previously, but probably haven't had the right voices listening. Definitely that. But it also, I've also found my place on the power of sport and what sport can do to, like I said, change perceptions, but also increase opportunities. It's a wonderful pathway to be able to do that for anyone.
Yeah, wow. What's a story, a narrative that you used to tell yourself that you've since outgrown?
I'd probably say when I was growing up, if I couldn't participate in things because I was in a wheelchair, you just kind of accept that. But I think that's to do with what you're always taught, to respect your elders and do all that type of thing. And so you never questioned it. And I pretty much outgrew that by the time I was 15 or 16. So I think that to me has been a really big motivator, where and I always split disability between two models. There's a medical model and a social model / UN model. And the medical model was really a significant part of community perception when I was growing up. And the medical model was, if you were a person with this disability, you had to be fixed, cured, or healed of that disability. Your disability was the reason why you couldn't participate. Whereas the social model is about, it's actually not a person's disability. It's attitudinal barriers, institutional barriers, communication barriers, physical barriers. Remove those barriers, and a person with disability can do anything. And if you apply that to my experience, I remember I was in 6th class when I was injured, and I wanted to go back to my school, but a lot of my school wasn't accessible. And the school made an amazing effort. They had like a working bee, like for all the parents, where they just built ramps. They built ramps for me for every building into that school, so I could go back into that school. So that school adopted that social model where the stairs were going to prevent me from going back to school and being with my classmates and being taught in a mainstream learning environment, which I wanted to be in. And they removed those barriers for me to be able to do that. And that meant that I could continue my learning, continue my education, just as Paul. And the chair wasn't the barrier. They removed the barriers of that physical access.
Stairs, that
exactly.
Was the barrier.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's a really great narrative around just how simple it is.
And the power of community.
Totally.
Brick by brick.
Brick by brick, ramp by ramp. And, not every ramp was at code, but it didn't matter. To me, it was just about getting in the building. And that really, and I think that was an important part of me growing up as well, is that accessibility isn't always going to be perfect, or inclusion isn't always going to be perfect, but let's just start with something and then build from there. Let's just get the person in the door, and then we can kind of, up the ante.
If I could give you a magic lamp and grant you 3 wishes to help, leaders like me or businesses like the ones that I work with become a more inclusive environment, right? To remove those barriers, what would your 3 wishes be?
My first wish would be just get started. There's no perfect moment.
Perfection is the enemy of the done.
Exactly. Bring people with disability into the conversation about what you want to do. So co-lead.
Yep.
And pass your knowledge on. I guarantee it'll be a positive experience, and share that experience with other leaders so they can follow your lead.
Where do the leaders, that might have diverse teams of people with different levels of ability or disability, where do we go wrong in trying to do the right thing? What are the misconceptions or the tripwires that we unintentionally cross?
We hear consistently, the first one, you're right, is they don't want to get it wrong.
Yeah.
They don't want to be tokenistic, and they don't know where to start. And so I think having that lived experience in the room assists with that, because it gives, like I said, the confidence, passes on the knowledge, and it gives a certainty that what you are doing is right, not tokenistic, and you're on the right path. So, but I also think that it's got to be embedded in all of your systems and processes as well. It's great to have a D&I team. It's great to say you're inclusive and you've got an accessible workplace. But if your systems and processes and your HR systems and even just not being able to support your people managers, that's where a lot of things fall down.
And if I work in an organisation that's just starting on this journey, right? And I don't have those systems and processes in place, but as an individual team leader, I want to take the first step. What practical advice can I do to be the facilitator of an inclusive environment?
Definitely look at the physical environment. Are there any barriers? And I know that seems really
self-evident.
simple. Like it should already be happening. But you'd be amazed how many physical spaces still aren't accessible. And when I talk about accessibility, I talk about obviously wheelchair access or universal access into the building. But it's got to extend beyond that. You've got to have an accessible toilet.
An accessible kitchenette.
All that kind of stuff. Those things aren't deal breakers, but definitely, flat entry into the building or accessible entry into the building, and a toilet amenity are your most fundamentals and basics. And if you don't have those, that's a significant barrier. And then from that point, it's really about, and I think it's great having, it's almost like a blank canvas where you just say, we're starting from scratch. Let's put inclusion in the middle of our diagram of how we want to grow and build everything around it. So inclusion becomes central. And when you do that, I always say, like, disability, well, it's a fact. Disability has intersectionality. So you can be a man, you can be a woman, LGBT plus, cold, whatever the case is. Disability intersects across all of those cohorts. It can happen today, it can happen tomorrow. It can be permanent, it can be temporary. And so when you plan for it, you actually make your workplace better for everyone ultimately.
I haven't thought about it that way. And beyond the physical, in your mind, what does a culture of inclusion look like?
So a culture of inclusion for me is ensuring that dignity, equity, and inclusion are fundamental to everything you do. So you can have an accessible and inclusive environment, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's always dignified.
And that you feel included.
That's right. And it's about creating a safe space to be able to do that. And I know that sounds a bit cliched, but it's really true. So the more you equip your team and your people leaders and your executive to know what those fundamentals are of inclusion, and they're not hard. It's just about how everyone likes to be treated. We all want to feel like we're valued. We all want to feel like our contribution is valued, and we all want a forum to be able to contribute. And sometimes for people with disability, that just doesn't happen. And so creating a space where that just is business as usual,
organically fostered,
is perfect.
You do incredible work, trying to help businesses and leaders foster this sort of culture and this sort of environment. When you look at the business, the efforts that industries are making, what seems authentic and what seems performative, right? Like I'd love your perspective on what you're seeing play out, because the DE&I obviously, kind of in a period of upheaval, surprising upheaval, unfortunately.
It's a really great question. So I think from my perspective, diversity inclusion will always be here, no matter what. That's a fact. I think what's potentially happened in the D&I space is that, and I know when I talk about disability, is that sometimes the broader diversity focus has kind of watered down those specific kind of disability or other kind
There's
of...
a big difference between D, E, and I.
Yeah, that's right.
If it's neurodiversity or physical
that's
ability.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
We kind of lump it into this big amalgam.
Yeah. And so actually, I think there's a really wonderful opportunity now to really get focused on what inclusion means.
Yeah.
And from my perspective, like I said, if you make something inclusive, if you open your door for Paul Nunnari, the wheelchair user, you will ultimately open your door for everyone.
Yeah.
That's a fact.
Yeah.
And so if we can kind of prioritise inclusion / disability for someone who might have a sensory disability, whether that be blind, low vision, deaf or hard of hearing, little d or capital D deaf, someone who might have limited mobility, wheelchair user, or use some other type of mobility device, or someone who has a cognitive disability, whether that be intellectual or, to your point, neurodivergent, it really focuses attention to what disability, the broader definition of disability, but also what it means to be inclusive for everyone and support that social model.
I want to shift gears. I want to understand a little bit more about you and what's under the hood. When have you proven yourself wrong about what you could do and what you were capable of?
Actually, that's a wonderful question. I've always used my disability in my situation to prove others wrong. So I remember a few years ago, my sister was doing aerial. She's an aerialist.
Oh, awesome.
And I saw her climb up the silk and doing her spinning around, and I was like, I wonder if I could do that in my wheelchair. It wasn't like, I wish I could do that, or I'll never be able to do that. I was like,
it was a curiosity,
how can I do that? So I worked out a way to strap my chair to my body. So when I climbed, the chair would stay on me. And I climbed up that silk. I learned how to spin myself around. That got uploaded to YouTube. And then the following year, some producers from Australia's Got Talent saw me and invited me to perform on Australia's Got Talent. And I made the grand final. And I've performed aerial all around the world.
No way.
So
that's an awesome story.
Yeah, it's just a really great story in the context that someone would just assume that someone in a wheelchair could never do that. And it's like, no, there's no limitations. There's just other ways of doing things. You use your legs and arms to climb up that silk. I just use my arms.
Yeah. Is there ever a radio that turns on in the back of your head? You know, that's good. Being wheelchair bound aside, just as a person, right? Like, is there ever a radio that turns on and like the rest of us starts to give you advice that's counter to convention, that's unhelpful?
Never.
Really?
Yeah, never. Wow. Never. I'm never in that space.
And do you think that that's a silver lining of your lived experience?
I think that's just inherently part of me.
Yeah.
I think being a wheelchair user, and I don't use the term wheelchair bound just because I'm never part of it. I'm never...
Yeah.
When I think of someone who's bound to something, like...
Yeah.
It's inherently part of you, and it's almost like you're... there's a character out of Batman, Bane, where... Oh, no, Venom, where Venom can totally consumes... the character. The chair's never consumed me. It's been a vehicle to drive what I want to drive, metaphorically as well. But I think that mentality and that perception's always been part of me, but it served me well through my education, through my professional career, my athletic career, and just in my day-to-day.
If I'm listening to this conversation and I'm a person of, disability or mixed ability, what advice would you give me to help turn that radio off if I'm not quite as, resilient and eyes to the sky
of course,
as yourself?
I would just...
I think that's such an amazing position of privilege to go, you know what, I don't feel those shackles.
Yeah, I think you can get from A to B in quite a traditional way.
Yeah.
But there's always another way you can get to A to B where you still get to B. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
there's always a scenic route.
Yeah. It doesn't matter how you get from A to B. All that matters is that you get there and you can get there through any means.
Where there's a will, there's a way.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Like there's
I do.
And adaptability is a beautiful thing, and be able to rethink or redefine how I can take that journey that isn't the traditional way is not only a great challenge, but when you get to the other side, it actually informs it informs how you might take on the next challenge, and then there's always going to be one.
I love that. What part of the work that you do right now are you most proud of that rarely gets seen?
I'm really proud of children with disability being used in brand campaigns that yesterday never had that opportunity.
Good. And why is that the thing that you're most proud of?
I see myself as those children when I was 11, and I never saw myself reflected in that content, but they will now see themselves reflected in that content today. And to be a small part of that, to make that happen is awesome, because if they see themselves reflected today, they can aspire to be anything they want tomorrow.
And everybody should be able to
do that.
Yeah. What's something that you were taught about success that you've actively unlearnt in the last few years?
I was always taught success sometimes is about how much money you make.
Yeah.
And whilst, you want to be remunerated for your skills and capabilities, that's great. It's about the legacy you leave, and sometimes it's not about the money. It's about, as we've discussed today, leaving the world a better place when you're no longer here.
And who inspires you? What are the voices that influence the work that you do and the way that you shape? Because clearly there are a lot of children that are going to live a much more fulfilled and a much more nourished life because of the work that you and your team pioneer. But where do you draw? Who fills your cup?
I don't have anyone in particular. Like I'm just inspired by or motivated by everyone. When I see someone achieve against all the odds, whether they're a person with disability or not, to me that's very motivating. And I think that tenacity and drive and determination, they're all key words that come into my mind. And anyone who showcases those against the odds, to me is motivating and inspiring.
What's one thing about environments that are deeply inclusive that you wish people knew more?
So a really good example that I talk about is Disneyland.
Yes.
Right?
You've done a lot of work with
Disney. People don't necessarily think that Disneyland is probably the most inclusive place, not only the most magical place in the universe, but the most inclusive place. And I always say the mouse doesn't generally do that because it's the nice thing to do. He does it because it's a commercial imperative.
Yeah.
And the commercial imperative is that the mouse knows that if a person with disability can get into that theme park, that person generally isn't just buying one ticket, they're buying collectively 5 or 6 tickets. And they know that if that person can get to food and beverage, to merchandise, to their hotels, on their cruise ships, on all their rides, then that's more money.
Yeah.
It's just a really wonderful example of that, creating an inclusive, accessible and welcoming environment for everyone provides really a great experience, an inclusive experience, and covers everything we've spoken about today, where you can share that experience with family. But on the other side, business, and let's be honest, business is always think, if I make things inclusive and accessible, it's going to cost me money.
Yeah, what's the opportunity cost of that?
But I can guarantee it costs you way more not to be accessible than to be accessible.
I think that there is some very surprising wisdom there. And do you think that the penny hasn't dropped there because we stigmatise co-locating those two discussions? God, we shouldn't be talking about commercial opportunity and inclusivity at the same time. And that actually does both sides a disservice.
I agree. I think it has been separated, but there's so many organisations now making the case. There was actually a study done in the UK called the Walk Away Pound, and that was basically all about what we've discussed: accessibility. So a person with disability walking away from a business or a marketing campaign that wasn't accessible or inclusive. And globally, that's $13 trillion a year.
Crazy.
And so the reason that sum's so big is, like I said, it's compounded by, it's just not my dollar. It's the party of people that surround me in my day-to-day activity that also won't spend that dollar because it's not accessible to me.
Has your mental model of inclusivity and creating environments that are made for all, has that changed over time, or has that been a fairly entrenched and well-worn mental model?
So you mean my mental model or the
your
inclusive
perspective over time, you know, someone that doesn't just experience it in their lived life, but, you know, advocates for it, champions it, you know. Has there been any shifts in what your mental model of what inclusivity looks like?
Yeah, look, I've always been on this perspective that, you know, accessibility isn't just about wheelchair access. You know what I mean? Like so that's just a basic 101.
Yeah.
But what I've found over time is, particularly those people with like a non-visible disability, sometimes there's a bit more, as community, sometimes we're little bit more patient with those whose disability we can see or define.
Yep.
So I've always tried to advocate that you've got to extend that consideration, that patience and that kindness to everyone, because you just don't know.
Yeah.
You can't look at every person with disability. Sorry, you can't look at every person and just assume they don't have some type of disability or carry some type of consideration that warrants your patience and consideration.
And is there a tension, do you think, between sort of the pace and the speed at which industry now requires, and to your point, the wisdom around just be patient with everybody and presume nothing and assume nothing to be inclusive?
I actually think we can go the opposite. I think if we remove barriers, then I always say I can perform, you know, I'm happy to work a 16-hour day, even though that's not required.
And no one should be
that, right? But I think sometimes there's still a bit of low expectations around what a person with disability can do. And I think we should always keep those expectations very high.
Yeah.
But make sure there's no barriers to prevent that from those expectations actually happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So give me an environment, give me attitudes that are conducive to me achieving my best and working at my best, and I'll deliver.
Yeah, let you decide when enough is enough. You know, don't presume that you know your capacity is any different from mine.
That's right.
But keep an environment where you could say, that's my enough.
Providing an environment and maintaining an environment where there's no barriers for me to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So, for example, if one of the requirements of a role is to drive a car, like I can drive a car.
Yeah.
But you know, I have hand controls that can fit into any car. But just making sure that those types of adaptations are available for people to be able to do that. We shouldn't just assume that if a car doesn't have hand controls on it, a person with disability can't, or someone who's a wheelchair user can't use it.
One last question before we get into our little sort of little ceremony at the end. If I want to know more about this, right, and I'm going, actually, look, you're right, I'm making these assumptions, and where would I go for great information to help me educate myself on establishing an inclusive and an inclusively made environment?
It'd be remiss of me not to talk about inclusively made. So definitely go to inclusivelymade.com. We've got some really great resources on there, and we're actually launching a fantastic campaign in June called The Inclusive, and you can find out more at theinclusive.com as well. But also there's two great organisations I want to reference, or three actually. So Bus Stop Films do amazing work in the in disability inclusion space across film and TV. There's another great organisation called PWD, or People with Disability Australia. They've got some amazing resources. And then the fourth organisation is the Australian Disability Network. And they work mainly in the disability employment inclusion space, but a wonderful organisation and doing amazing things. 25.
We'll make sure that we link those four resources.
Yeah, they're great touch points, and then you can kind of build your references from there.
And I think my perception outside looking in is, you know, even if I look into myself, it's the assumptions. It's, you know, often a misattribution of efforts or conciliations that we want to make that might actually put us on the wrong path. So I think it's on us as leaders and as businesses to just educate ourselves. It's our duty.
Absolutely. And the resources are there.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're there.
Last three little short untold stories from me. No, Paul, when was the last time you surprised yourself?
So the last time I surprised myself, that's a really great question. Maybe last night. Maybe last night was good. Recent. So had a great dinner last night with Amagi and the team from Tinkerbell, and I went out with Henry, the founder of Inclusively Made, and we got some ice cream, and it just reinforced just the simple things.
Life is good.
Is good. You know, having dinner with great friends, having an ice cream, walking along the foreshore, and just enjoying the wonderful environment we are here.
What surprised you?
You know, we get busy during the day. You know, like
we're all so busy being
we're all
busy.
so busy.
Yeah.
You know, really working on what we're passionate about.
Yeah.
And it's sometimes just to take a breath sometimes and just enjoy that journey as well.
I love that. Paul, what part of you still feels in progress?
I love learning and I love learning from others. And I think that's always, to me, that, you know, I think that's still a part of being in progress, is that you never stop learning, and you should never want to stop learning.
Yeah.
And I think also you should never want to stop learning from other people's lived experiences. And that should inform, you know, that path as well.
Very well said. Final question from me, mate. If this chapter of your life had a name, what would the title of the chapter be? And what would you hope the next chapter's called?
This chapter of my life would be... I'll probably lend from a Nike logo, which is Just Do It.
Awesome. Great chapter title.
Yeah. And the next chapter would be Let's Go.
Paul, thank you so much for taking the time. I think the work that you do representing those that should live a happy and fulfilled life is absolutely profound. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. It's been wonderful.